2 words. That is all it took. Not a lengthy communique drafted by armies of lawyers, not a formal diplomatic notice delivered through back-channel intermediaries, not a carefully structured press release with spin-controlled language designed to soften the blow. Just 2 words spoken with complete finality that ended a partnership 4 decades in the making and sent shockwaves through every financial market on the planet within minutes of their utterance. The statement arrived at 9:14 a.m. Eastern on a Tuesday morning that had begun like any other, with currency traders settling into their positions, logistics managers reviewing shipment schedules, and boardrooms across 3 continents preparing for quarterly earnings, calls that would never unfold as anticipated. By 9:17 a.m., the first tremors had registered. By 9:31 a.m., 17 minutes after those 2 words were spoken, $84 billion in combined market capitalization had evaporated from publicly traded companies directly tied to the partnership. By end of trading that day, the figure had climbed to $213 billion. Warren Buffett, reached by his biographer that same afternoon, described what happened as the clearest example he had witnessed in 62 years of investing of what he called the fragility premium, the hidden cost that accumulates silently in every relationship built on assumption rather than architecture. He said, and these words would be repeated in boardrooms for months afterward, that the most expensive sentence in business is the one that begins with the words, "I assumed." The partnership in question had been constructed in 1984 at a moment when the global economic order was being redrawn and 2 institutional giants had recognized in each other a complementary strength neither possessed alone. For 40 years, through recessions and recoveries, through leadership transitions and strategic pivots, through moments of friction and periods of extraordinary alignment, the arrangement had endured. Industry observers had described it as structurally permanent. Academic case studies had cited it as a model of sustained institutional cooperation. 3 generations of executives on both sides had built careers around its continuity. And then it ended. In 2 words, spoken by a single individual in a room of 14 people on a Wednesday afternoon in late spring. What those 14 people witnessed, what the financial markets absorbed in real time, and what Warren Buffett identified as a defining case study in institutional collapse, that is what the next 27 minutes will explain. When you hear what was said in that room in the 30 seconds before those 2 words were spoken, why the mechanisms that should have prevented this moment had been systematically dismantled over the preceding 18 months, and what Buffett says every leadership team must do before the next quarterly review to ensure they are not sitting in an equivalent room, you will understand why this was not a business dispute, but a fundamental reckoning with how partnerships actually function beneath the surface of their documented terms. The story begins not in 2024, but in 1984, in a city that no longer exists in the form it occupied then, between 2 institutions that have each transformed beyond recognition since their original principals signed the foundational agreement across a conference table on the 43rd floor of a building that has since been demolished. The original accord ran to 847 pages and took 31 months to negotiate across 47 formal sessions involving 312 individual participants from both sides. The lead negotiator on one side would later write in his memoir that the document they produced was not a contract, but a constitution, a living architecture meant to evolve with circumstances rather than constrain them. What made the partnership exceptional was not its scale, though the scale was extraordinary. At its height, the arrangement governed the movement of $34 billion in annual transactions, employed directly or indirectly 417,000 workers across 11 countries, and represented the single largest bilateral commercial relationship in its industry category anywhere in the world. What made it exceptional was its redundancy architecture, the 17 separate mechanisms built into the original agreement specifically designed to prevent any single point of failure from cascading into systemic collapse. 14 of those 17 mechanisms had been quietly deactivated between March 2022 and September 2023. The deactivation was not dramatic. It did not happen through formal amendment or board resolution. It happened the way most institutional failures happen, through accumulated small decisions, each individually defensible, collectively catastrophic. A cost-cutting initiative eliminated 3 oversight positions in April 2022. A strategic efficiency review consolidated 4 dispute resolution channels into 1 in August 2022. A technology modernization project deprecated 2 legacy communication protocols in January 2023 without replacing the human escalation pathways those protocols had supported. A budget reconciliation in September 2023 eliminated the Joint Monitoring Committee that had met quarterly since 1989. None of these decisions was made with any intention of weakening the partnership. Each was made by competent professionals pursuing legitimate organizational objectives. The problem was the absence of anyone whose explicit responsibility was to track the cumulative effect of individually rational decisions on systemic resilience. By October 2023, the partnership that had been engineered with 17 redundant safety mechanisms was operating with 3. And those 3 were all contained within a single organizational layer that reported to a single executive who, as of November 2023, had competing incentive structures that subtly misaligned his interests from the partnership's continuity. His name was not recorded in any public filing. The individuals who would later document the collapse referred to him consistently as the Integration Director, a title that captured both his formal authority and the irony of his role in what ultimately transpired. The Integration Director had joined the organization in 2019 with an impressive credential set and a strategic mandate to streamline what his onboarding brief described as legacy complexity. He understood the partnership's documented terms with precision. He did not understand, because no one had ensured he understood, the undocumented architecture of relationships, protocols, and mutual accommodations that had accumulated across 4 decades and upon which the documented terms actually depended for their functional operation. By early 2024, 11 months before the 2 words were spoken, the warning signals had begun to accumulate. Response times on routine queries had extended from the contractually specified 48 hours to an average of 11 days. 4 joint working groups that had met monthly since 2007 had stopped convening. A scheduled 18-month strategic review, the 14th in the partnership's history, had been postponed twice and then quietly removed from the forward calendar without formal notification to the other party. On the other side of the partnership, these signals were being observed, documented, and discussed with increasing alarm. An internal memo dated March 14, 2024, circulated among 7 senior executives, described the situation in language that was precise without being alarmist. The memo identified 23 specific behavioral changes in the partner organization over the preceding 14 months, categorized them by severity and reversibility, and concluded with a recommendation that a formal dialogue be initiated at the principal level within 60 days. The formal dialogue was requested. It was acknowledged. It was scheduled for May, then rescheduled for July, then offered a date in September with a proposed agenda that the requesting party's legal team identified as containing language that systematically excluded the 23 specific concerns from the discussion scope. The September meeting was declined. A counterproposal was submitted in October. No response arrived for 31 days. On November 7, 2024, at 2:17 p.m. local time, the delegation of 7, including the chief executive, the chief legal officer, and the chief operating officer of the requesting party, arrived at the headquarters of the partner organization for what had finally been scheduled as a principal-level strategic alignment session. The meeting had been confirmed 4 times in writing over the preceding 3 weeks. The agenda had been jointly agreed. The room had been booked. The delegation was kept waiting in the reception area for 47 minutes. No explanation was offered. Coffee was not provided after the initial offering. The individual who eventually emerged to escort them was not the counterpart chief executive, as the agenda specified, but a deputy who had not been mentioned in any prior correspondence. In the conference room, the 7-person delegation was met by 4 individuals, none of whom held the authority level the agenda required. The counterpart chief executive was described as unavailable. A scheduling conflict was cited without elaboration. The deputy offered to proceed with a preliminary discussion pending future principal engagement. The chief executive of the requesting party, a 58-year-old executive with 31 years in the industry, who had personally managed this partnership relationship for 11 of those years, looked at the 4 people across the table. She looked at the empty chairs where their counterparts should have been sitting. She looked at the agenda in front of her that specified discussions her organization had been requesting for 14 months. She placed the agenda document face down on the table. She stood. Her 6 colleagues stood. And she said 2 words, "We're done." The financial markets processed the implications of what happened next with the efficiency that only genuine shock produces. By 9:14 a.m. Eastern, the following morning, the moment the non-disclosure agreement's notification clause activated and both parties were required to disclose the partnership's termination to their respective regulatory bodies, 17 analyst teams on 3 continents had already revised their models. The supply chain disruptions began manifesting within 72 hours. By the end of the first week, 23,000 workers across 6 countries had been formally notified of operational changes directly attributable to the termination. By the end of the first month, the downstream effects had reached 847 supplier organizations that had built portions of their business models around the partnership's continuity. The automotive sector absorbed $31 billion in unanticipated costs within 90 days. The logistics industry recorded its largest single-month rate increase in 14 years. 3 mid-sized companies that had structured their entire operations around the partnership's supply chain filed for bankruptcy protection within 6 months. The pension funds of 41,000 workers in associated industries recorded an average 12% decline in value attributable in whole or significant part to the termination's cascade effects. The integration director, whose accumulated decisions had dismantled 14 of the 17 protective mechanisms, had left the organization 4 months before the September meeting that was declined. He accepted a senior role at a competitor with a compensation package 34% above his previous salary, carrying no contractual accountability for outcomes attributable to decisions made during his tenure. His departure had not triggered any formal review of the structural changes implemented under his leadership. The deputy who met the 7-person delegation in the conference room submitted his resignation the following morning. His letter, later obtained through discovery proceedings, contained a single sentence beyond the formal resignation. "I was told they would not actually leave." Warren Buffett's response to the collapse came not through public statement, but through a private letter to the chief executives of 14 companies in his portfolio, obtained by his authorized biographer and included with permission in a subsequent publication. The letter was dated 4 days after the termination became public. It was 7 paragraphs. The paragraph that circulated most widely in business school curricula read as follows: "In 62 years of watching businesses operate, I have never seen a relationship destroyed by a single catastrophic decision. I have seen hundreds destroyed by the accumulation of small decisions that each seemed correct in isolation, but collectively dismantled the architecture upon which the relationship's actual function depended. The 2 words spoken last week were not the cause of what happened. They were the invoice for costs that had been accumulating for 30 months. He went further in a conversation recorded for his biographer 3 weeks later. The question he posed was one that every chief executive in every industry needed to sit with. If your most important relationship ended today, would you know within 48 hours? Not from a press release, not from a legal filing, from the relationship itself, from the people, the protocols, the living architecture that either exists or does not exist beneath the documented terms. Most executives, Buffett said, would have to answer honestly that they would not know for weeks. And that gap between the documented partnership and the functioning relationship is where 40 years goes to die. The legal proceedings that followed the termination generated 4,200 pages of discovery documents over 18 months. The arbitration panel's preliminary findings, released in summary form, identified 23 specific decision points between March 2022 and November 2024, at which different choices by identified individuals would have altered the trajectory toward a different outcome. Not one of those 23 decision points involved bad faith. Not one involved malice. Every single decision, the panel found, was made by a competent professional acting within their organizational mandate and applying reasonable judgment to the information available to them at the time. The system failed, not the people. The system that should have ensured those 23 decision points were visible to someone with both the authority and the mandate to evaluate their cumulative effect, that system had been eliminated in the name of efficiency between 2022 and 2023. The 40-year partnership had not been destroyed. It had been allowed to atrophy, while everyone with the authority to reverse the atrophy assumed someone else was monitoring the cumulative effect of individually reasonable decisions on systemic resilience. 2 words ended it. 30 months of accumulated institutional neglect made those 2 words inevitable. So here is where we stand. A 40-year partnership generating $34 billion in annual transactions, employing 417,000 workers across 11 countries, and engineered with 17 redundant protective mechanisms, was reduced to 2 words spoken across an empty conference table by a chief executive who had spent 14 months requesting a conversation that never arrived. Warren Buffett identified it as the clearest demonstration in 62 years of his investing career that institutional relationships do not end. They are ended by the accumulation of small decisions that no one is responsible for reviewing in aggregate. The 14 safety mechanisms dismantled between 2022 and 2023 were not dismantled by enemies. They were dismantled by professionals pursuing efficiency. The outcome was identical. Can a partnership of 40 years be rebuilt from 2 words? Can 17 protective mechanisms be restored once the institutional memory of why they were built has retired or departed? And the question that reaches beyond this specific case into every boardroom where a 40-year relationship is assumed to be structurally permanent. Who in your organization is responsible for the gap between your documented partnership and your functioning relationship? And when did they last look? Please hit the bell icon and subscribe my channel for daily updates.